The funniest lie is the one everyone applauds before the truth walks into the room. Rachel lifted her wine glass with the confidence of someone who had never expected to be questioned. The chandeliers above us scattered warm light across polished crystal, silver cutlery, and smiling faces gathered for our 12th wedding anniversary. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, and a few relatives filled the private dining room of one of the nicest restaurants in downtown Dallas. Soft jazz drifted through the air. Expensive perfume mixed with the smell of grilled steak and fresh bread. Everything looked elegant. Everything looked perfect. Then Rachel laughed. "I guess I deserve a little credit," she said with a playful smile. "Keeping a grown man alive isn't cheap." The table erupted with laughter. Someone clinked a glass. Another person nodded as if she had just shared the funniest truth in the world. Rachel looked toward me, still smiling. "Michael's a wonderful husband," she continued. "But let's be honest. If it weren't for my salary, we wouldn't even be sitting in this restaurant tonight." More laughter. Louder this time. "My name is Michael Bennett. I am 44 years old, born and raised in Texas. I have spent the last 20 years building a regional logistics company that most people have never heard of because my name has never been on the side of a truck. I have always believed that real success is measured by peace, not applause. I never cared about expensive watches, flashy cars, or telling strangers how much money I made. I believed that if my family slept safely every night, my work had already spoken loudly enough. Looking back now, I realize silence has a cost. Sometimes it gives lies enough room to grow roots. Rachel and I met when we were both 29. She was ambitious, energetic, and fearless inside every room she entered. I admired that about her. She admired that I stayed calm when everything around me seemed to fall apart. We balanced each other. At least, that was what I believed. The early years were simple. We rented a small apartment outside Fort Worth. The air conditioner rattled every summer, and the kitchen was barely large enough for two people to stand inside together. Friday nights meant frozen pizza, old movies, and talking about dreams that seemed impossibly far away. Back then, neither of us cared who paid for dinner because we were building something together. Or so I thought. Success arrived slowly, then all at once. My company grew one warehouse into 3, then 3 into 8. Every expansion meant longer hours, more responsibility, and more nights coming home after Rachel had already fallen asleep. She built a successful career in corporate marketing. I celebrated every promotion she earned, every bonus, every achievement. I never compared our incomes because marriage was never supposed to be a scoreboard. Somewhere along the way, though, something changed. It happened quietly, quiet enough that I almost missed it. Rachel started correcting people whenever they complimented our house. "Well," she would say with a laugh, "someone around here has to make the real money." Everyone assumed she was joking. I smiled because arguing over a joke felt childish. Then the jokes became stories. The stories became facts. Friends began asking whether I enjoyed staying home while Rachel carried the financial load. Co-workers teased me during company gatherings even though they had never seen a single page of our finances. Neighbors made comments about how lucky I was to have such a successful wife. Every time I heard one of those remarks, I felt the same pressure settle across my chest. Not anger, not humiliation, something heavier. The weight of realizing someone else had been writing the story of my life while I remained silent. I never corrected anyone. Maybe I should have. Maybe I believed Rachel would eventually stop. Maybe I thought protecting my marriage mattered more than protecting my pride. The strange thing about false stories is that they become stronger every time the truth refuses to interrupt them. Across the table, Rachel reached for my hand. Anyone watching would have called it affection. I recognized it as performance. She squeezed my fingers just enough to make the room believe we were perfectly happy. Then she smiled at everyone again. "Michael always tells me I work too hard," she said. "But somebody has to keep the mortgage paid." More laughter rolled through the room. I lowered my eyes toward the glass in front of me. The ice had almost completely melted. Tiny drops of water slid down the side like a slow clock, counting towards something I could not yet see. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply listened. Because there was one thing no one else at that table knew. Every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every insurance premium, every vacation, every restaurant reservation, every anniversary gift, every dollar that kept our life standing had traveled through a single accountant before reaching its destination. And his records never forgot anything. The laughter lingered even after the waiter returned to refill everyone's glasses. It floated through the room like harmless music, but every joke landed with the weight of another brick on a foundation that had already begun to crack. I smiled politely because that was what people expected from a husband. Smile. Nod. Keep the evening comfortable. I had spent years becoming good at that. Rachel accepted another compliment with effortless grace. One of her co-workers raised his glass toward her. "You are proof that hard work pays off," he said. Not everyone could support an entire household. Rachel laughed again, tilting her head just enough to look humble without actually denying the claim. "Somebody has to be responsible," she replied. The room rewarded her with another chorus of laughter. I studied the people around the table instead of looking at her. Most of them were not cruel. They were simply repeating the version of our marriage they had been told for years. Human beings believe the story they hear most often. They rarely stop to ask who wrote it. Across the room, a young server carefully balanced a tray filled with coffee cups. The soft clink of porcelain sounded louder to me than the conversations around us. Strange how ordinary details become unforgettable when your life quietly changes direction. I remembered another dinner almost 10 years earlier. Rachel had just received her first major promotion. She walked into our kitchen carrying a bottle of sparkling cider because neither of us drank much back then. She wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "We are finally getting somewhere." We opened 2 inexpensive glasses and celebrated together. There was no competition, no scoreboard, just 2 people believing every victory belonged to both of them. Somewhere between that apartment and this elegant dining room, the word "we" slowly disappeared. It became my career, my money, my success. I never noticed exactly when it happened. Looking back, maybe it happened one conversation at a time. One compliment accepted without correction. One joke repeated until it became part of our identity. My phone vibrated once inside my jacket pocket. I glanced down at the screen beneath the table. It was a calendar reminder I had created weeks earlier. Quarterly financial review with Daniel Foster. Tomorrow, 8 o'clock in the morning. I dismissed the notification without opening it, but seeing Daniel's name settled something inside me. Daniel had managed my personal and business accounting for nearly 15 years. He believed numbers were honest, even when people were not. Every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every insurance premium, every utility statement, every tuition reimbursement for Rachel's graduate program, every vacation booking, every charitable donation, every credit card balance had passed through records that Daniel maintained with almost obsessive precision. Paper remembered what people conveniently forgot. Rachel reached for the dessert menu and smiled toward her closest friend, Melissa. "Do you remember when Michael wanted to buy that pickup truck?" she asked. Melissa nodded. Rachel laughed before continuing. I had to explain that somebody had to think about the budget. Another round of amused smiles circled the table. The story sounded believable because it contained just enough truth. I had wanted the truck. I had decided not to buy it. What nobody knew was that I postponed it because we were finalizing the purchase of another warehouse for my company. Cash flow mattered more than appearances. 6 months later, after the expansion was complete, I quietly bought the truck outright, without financing a single dollar. Rachel never mentioned that part because it did not fit the version of me she preferred people to see. The waiter placed slices of chocolate cake in front of everyone. Rachel thanked him warmly. She had always been charming with strangers. That was one of the reasons people trusted her so easily. She knew exactly how to make every conversation feel effortless. I looked around the table once more. Friends were laughing. Silverware touched china. Someone complimented the wine selection. Outside the restaurant windows, the Dallas skyline shimmered beneath the evening sky, steady and unmoved by the small dramas unfolding inside expensive rooms. I wondered how many marriages looked perfect from the outside, while carrying invisible fractures underneath. The answer was probably more than anyone wanted to admit. Rachel leaned closer to me and lowered her voice just enough that only I could hear. "Do not look so serious," she whispered with a practiced smile still fixed on her face. "People might think I am actually telling the truth." She laughed softly before turning back toward the guests. Her words stayed with me long after she looked away. Not because they hurt, because they confirmed something I had refused to admit. She knew exactly what she was doing. This was not misunderstanding. It was strategy. It was an image carefully maintained over years, one story at a time. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and took a slow breath. The room felt warm. The conversation sounded distant. My heartbeat remained calm. I did not need to defend myself tonight. Truth does not become stronger because it speaks first. Sometimes it becomes unforgettable because it waits until everyone has finished believing the lie. The evening finally began to wind down, but the stories Rachel had told continued moving from one side of the table to the other, like quiet echoes finding new voices. I watched people repeat her version of our marriage without even realizing they were doing it. One guest joked that I should start teaching classes on how to retire early with a successful spouse. Another laughed and asked Rachel if she accepted applications from husbands looking for financial sponsorship. Rachel never corrected them. She smiled, shook her head modestly, and let the assumptions breathe. That was the remarkable thing about carefully crafted lies. They did not need to be repeated by the person who created them. Eventually, everyone else carried them forward. We stepped outside the restaurant nearly an hour later. The Texas air had cooled, carrying the distant sound of traffic through downtown Dallas. Valets hurried from one luxury vehicle to another while couples lingered beneath the lights, finishing conversations before driving home. Rachel slipped her arm through mine just as several coworkers walked past us. She kissed my cheek and smiled brightly, playing the role of the devoted wife one last time before everyone disappeared into the night. As soon as the last familiar face drove away, her smile faded. The silence between us lasted almost an entire city block. I kept my eyes on the windshield while the traffic lights reflected across the hood of the truck. Rachel finally broke the silence. "You hardly spoke tonight," she said. Her voice sounded casual, but I recognized the calculation beneath it. "I did not have much to add," I answered. She looked out the passenger window. "You could have at least laughed with everyone." I nodded once. "I suppose I could have." She sighed with quiet frustration. "People like confidence, Michael. You always make everything awkward by looking so serious." I almost smiled at the irony. Confidence had never been my problem. I had simply never confused confidence with performance. The drive home took 35 minutes. Neither of us turned on the radio. The only sounds came from tires rolling across the highway and the occasional turn signal clicking inside the cab. I remembered another drive years ago after we bought our first home. Rachel had cried happy tears the entire way back from the closing office. She squeezed my hand and kept repeating the same sentence. We finally did it. I had believed every word. The mortgage had been automatically drafted from an account funded entirely through distributions from my business. Rachel knew that. She signed the same closing documents I did. She watched every payment leave the account month after month. Yet somewhere over the years, memory surrendered to convenience. The story changed because the new version sounded better at parties. We pulled into the driveway just before 11. Our home sat quietly beneath the porch lights, the same brick house we had purchased 12 years earlier. Neighbors often complimented Rachel on keeping such a beautiful place. She always thanked them. I never interrupted to explain who paid the contractors, landscapers, roof repairs, insurance renewals, or property taxes. I told myself that keeping score damaged marriages. Tonight, I finally understood something different. Refusing to acknowledge the score does not erase it. It only allows someone else to rewrite it. Rachel disappeared upstairs without another word, saying she was exhausted from entertaining guests all evening. I remained in the kitchen. The house felt unusually still. I poured a glass of water and stood beside the window overlooking the backyard. The patio lights reflected softly across the swimming pool we had installed 5 summers earlier. Rachel had proudly told friends it was her reward for years of hard work. In reality, the construction contract had been negotiated through my office during a quarterly meeting between warehouse expansion projects. The invoice had been paid from the same account that quietly supported nearly every major expense in our lives. My phone vibrated again. This time it was not a calendar reminder. It was an email from Daniel Foster. Subject line, "Quarterly Financial Review Documents Ready." I opened it without thinking. Attached were summaries of investment accounts, business distributions, tax estimates, property expenses, household expenditures, and every payment scheduled for the coming quarter. Daniel always prepared everything with military precision. Near the bottom of the email was one sentence that caught my attention. "Please review the household expense summary before tomorrow. There are several trends you may want to discuss." I stared at those words longer than I expected. Daniel rarely added personal comments. If he believed something deserved My attention, it usually did. I closed the email and set the phone on the counter. The kitchen clock quietly marked each passing second. Somewhere upstairs, Rachel was probably already asleep, convinced another successful performance had strengthened the image she had spent years creating. Downstairs, surrounded by silence, I began wondering whether the numbers Daniel wanted me to see would reveal more than unpaid balances and monthly expenses. Sometimes the truth does not arrive with an accusation. Sometimes it arrives inside an ordinary spreadsheet that remembers every decision people hope everyone else will eventually forget. Morning arrived with the same quiet routine that had shaped my life for years. The coffee maker started humming at 6:15. Sunlight crept across the hardwood floor in long golden lines. The neighborhood outside looked peaceful, almost untouched by the tension that had settled inside our home. Rachel came downstairs dressed for work, carrying her laptop bag and scrolling through emails before she even reached the kitchen. She poured herself coffee without looking up. "You left before I woke up yesterday," she said casually. "Big meeting." I nodded. "Quarterly financial review." She smiled without lifting her eyes from the screen. "Must be nice having so much free time that you can spend entire mornings talking about numbers." I simply took another sip of coffee. She kissed my cheek, grabbed her car keys, and walked out the front door. 20 seconds later, I heard her luxury sedan pull away from the driveway. The house became silent again. Silence has a strange way of clearing the mind. Without conversations filling the air, memories become louder. I remembered the first year after my business finally became profitable. I had suggested creating separate household accounts, so every bill would be organized professionally. Rachel agreed immediately because she said she hated dealing with paperwork. That decision seemed practical at the time. My business distributions flowed into one account. Automatic payments handled nearly every expense connected to our life. Mortgage, property taxes, homeowners insurance, utilities, vehicle, insurance, maintenance, vacation reservations. Even Rachel's graduate school tuition years earlier had quietly passed through the same system. She knew the arrangement because we discussed it together. She signed authorization forms beside me. Yet somehow the truth slowly disappeared from every conversation outside our home. By 7:45, I was walking into Daniel Foster's office. His accounting firm occupied the fourth floor of a modest brick building overlooking a busy Dallas intersection. Daniel had never believed in expensive decorations. His office reflected his personality. Clean desk, organized shelves, framed certifications, no distractions. Numbers were the only language he completely trusted. He stood to shake my hand the moment I entered. "Good morning, Michael." "Morning, Daniel." He studied my face for a moment longer than usual. "Rough anniversary?" I smiled faintly. "Something like that." He nodded without asking another question. That was another reason I respected him. He never chased gossip. Facts always came first. He slid a thick folder across the conference table. "Everything is prepared. Business performance remains strong. Investments exceeded projections again this quarter." We spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing warehouse revenue, operating expenses, tax estimates, and long-term planning. Everything looked stable, predictable, exactly the way I preferred running both my business and my life. Then Daniel closed the financial statements and opened another folder. Smaller, thinner, labeled household expenses. His expression changed almost immediately. "This," he said quietly, "is why I asked you not to skip today's meeting." I leaned forward. Daniel spread several pages across the table. Every payment was listed by date, category, account, and recipient. Mortgage, electricity, water, internet, landscaping, home repairs, insurance, vacation deposits, medical expenses, restaurant reservations, anniversary gifts. Everything. Every line traced back to one primary funding account. Mine. Daniel pointed toward the summary page. 100% of the household operating expenses during the last 11 years were funded through your distributions or your investment accounts. I nodded slowly. "I expected that. I thought you probably did." He hesitated before turning another page. What concerned me was something else. He rotated the document toward me. A list of credit card charges filled nearly 3 pages. Designer boutiques, luxury spas, jewelry stores, high-end department stores, weekend shopping trips. Nothing illegal, nothing shocking. But one detail repeated beside almost every transaction. Authorized user card. Daniel folded his hands together. Rachel's personal spending increased almost 40% over the last 3 years. I looked at the figures without speaking. Numbers do not accuse anyone. They simply exist. Daniel continued carefully. The purchases themselves are not the issue. You can clearly afford them. What concerns me is the pattern. He reached into the folder one final time and removed several printed screenshots. Public social media posts. Rachel smiling beside expensive handbags. Rachel posing in front of our home. Rachel celebrating promotions with captions about independence and financial success. Hundreds of comments praised her for supporting the household almost entirely on her own. Daniel looked at me with genuine concern. Michael, I normally ignore personal matters, but several clients forwarded these posts because they recognized your house. They assumed they were complimenting you. Then I realized something. He paused. The room felt unusually quiet. She is publicly claiming responsibility for a financial picture that does not match a single document in these records. I lowered my eyes toward the spreadsheets again. The paper remained perfectly still beneath my hands. No anger, no shouting, no dramatic revelation. Just columns of dates, account numbers, and transactions quietly refusing to lie. Daniel broke the silence one last time. If anyone ever challenges the truth, these records can account for every dollar, every payment, every bill, every year. I closed the folder carefully and rested my hand on the cover. Outside the conference room window, traffic moved steadily through another ordinary Tuesday morning. Inside that office, surrounded by nothing more than ink, paper, and arithmetic, I realized the strongest witness I had was never going to be a person. It was 12 years of financial records that remembered every promise long after people decided to rewrite them. I carried the folders home without opening them again. They rested on the passenger seat through the entire drive, secured by nothing more than a leather strap. Yet they felt heavier than any contract I had signed in years. Numbers have a peculiar kind of gravity. They do not raise their voices. They do not defend themselves. They simply wait for someone willing to read them. By the time I turned into our neighborhood, the afternoon sun had settled low enough to cast long shadows across the streets. Children rode bicycles between driveways. Lawn mowers hummed in the distance. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across green lawns. From the outside, our neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had the day we moved in. Stability has a convincing appearance. It hides fractures well. Rachel's car was already in the driveway when I pulled in beside it. She rarely came home before 6, but today she had beaten me by nearly an hour. I stepped inside and found her sitting at the kitchen island, typing quickly on her laptop while talking through a wireless headset. Her voice sounded bright, polished, and confident. Absolutely, she said with an easy laugh. Leadership is really about carrying people who cannot carry themselves. I stopped just inside the doorway. She had not noticed me yet. A few seconds later, she continued. Honestly, balancing my career and supporting everything at home has taught me more than any management seminar ever could. I closed the front door softly. She looked up, smiled, and immediately changed her tone. I will send those files tonight, she said into the headset before ending the call. You are home early, she said as if nothing unusual had happened. Meeting finished ahead of schedule? Yes, I answered. Everything went smoothly. She smiled and closed the laptop. Good. I was thinking we should invite everyone over this weekend. My parents have been asking about the anniversary dinner, and Melissa said she wanted to hear the funny stories. Funny stories. I knew exactly which stories she meant. The ones where she carried our finances while I quietly followed behind. The ones everyone laughed at because they believed they were harmless. I placed my briefcase beside the dining table without mentioning the folders inside. That sounds like a full house, I said. Rachel nodded enthusiastically. It will be nice. My parents adore you. I almost smiled. They did adore me. They simply adored a version of me that had been carefully edited over the years. Rachel walked toward the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water. Dad keeps telling everyone how proud he is that I built such a comfortable life for us. She laughed softly. He always exaggerates. I watched her pour the water into a glass. There it was again. Another opportunity to tell the truth. Another opportunity quietly left untouched. I wondered how many chances she had passed by before I finally noticed the pattern. Dinner was unusually calm that evening. Rachel talked about office politics, upcoming projects, and a leadership conference she wanted to attend in Chicago. I listened more than I spoke. Every few minutes my eyes drifted toward the briefcase resting beside the dining room wall. 12 years of financial history waited inside. 12 years that contradicted almost every public story Rachel had allowed to grow. After dinner, she disappeared upstairs to answer another work call. I carried the dishes into the kitchen, loaded the dishwasher, and stood alone beside the sink. The house felt peaceful again. The kind of peace that often arrives just before everything changes. My phone buzzed across the countertop. A message from Melissa appeared on the screen. At first, I assumed it had been sent by mistake. Michael, I wanted to tell you how inspiring it is that you support Rachel the way you do. Not every man is secure enough to let his wife carry the financial burden without feeling threatened. I read the message twice. Then a third time. She truly believed every word. She was not trying to insult me. She was complimenting the marriage she thought existed. I thanked her politely and set the phone back down. A few moments later, another notification appeared. This time it was from Rachel herself, even though she was only one floor above me. Do not forget Saturday. Everyone is excited. I looked toward the staircase. Everyone. Her parents. Her coworkers. Our closest friends. The same audience that had applauded every version of the story except the true one. My eyes settled once more on the briefcase. Daniel's words echoed quietly in my mind. Every payment. Every bill. Every year. I realized something then that I had not fully understood before leaving his office. Those records were never meant to embarrass Rachel. They existed for accountability. The choice to use them had always belonged to me. Upstairs, I heard Rachel laughing through another conference call. Downstairs, surrounded by the quiet rhythm of an ordinary evening, I made a decision that felt neither emotional nor impulsive. If everyone was coming to our house on Saturday, then Saturday would no longer belong to the story they had been told. It would belong to the truth that had been waiting patiently in a leather briefcase for 12 very long years. Saturday arrived wrapped in bright Texas sunshine and the quiet confidence of a day that looked completely ordinary from the outside. By 8 o'clock that morning, I was already in the backyard wiping down the patio table while the smoker filled the air with the familiar scent of oak wood and slow-cooked brisket. For years, weekends like this had been my favorite. Friends would gather. Families would laugh. Children would run through the yard while adults argued about football, barbecue, and the weather. Somewhere along the way, those simple afternoons became another stage where the same story was performed again and again. Rachel stepped onto the patio carrying a clipboard covered with handwritten notes. My parents should be here around noon, she said. Melissa and Brian will probably come a little early to help set up. She looked around the yard and smiled with satisfaction. Everything looks beautiful. I nodded. It usually does. She did not notice the second meaning hidden inside those words. Beauty often survives longer than honesty. By late morning, the house slowly filled with familiar voices. Rachel's parents arrived first, carrying homemade desserts and bottles of sparkling cider. Her father, Richard, wrapped me in a firm handshake before patting my shoulder. You take good care of our girl, he said warmly. She works hard, but I know she carries a lot on her shoulders. I smiled politely. She certainly works hard. That much had always been true. Hard work had never been the problem. Truth had. Melissa and Brian arrived next, followed by several co-workers from Rachel's office. Before long, the backyard buzzed with conversation. Glasses clinked together. Laughter drifted across the fence. Someone complimented the landscaping. Another guest admired the outdoor kitchen renovation we completed 2 years earlier. Rachel accepted every compliment with effortless confidence. It took years of planning, she said proudly. Sometimes you just have to stay disciplined with your finances. I noticed several guests glance toward her with admiration. They saw ambition. They saw success. They saw a woman who appeared to have built everything standing around them. Nobody asked where the invoices had been sent. Nobody asked whose account had quietly funded every improvement. They only heard the story they expected to hear. I stood beside the grill turning brisket with long steel tongs while listening without interrupting. Heat rose from the smoker in slow waves. Smoke curled into the clear blue sky. The rhythm of cooking settled my thoughts the same way it always had. You cannot rush barbecue. You cannot rush truth either. Both require patience before they reveal their full value. Rachel eventually gathered everyone beneath the covered patio where lunch was ready to be served. Plates filled quickly. Conversations overlapped. Richard raised a glass and smiled toward his daughter. I want to say something before we eat, he announced. The yard gradually became quiet. Watching Rachel build such a successful career has been one of the greatest joys of my life. Applause followed. Rachel smiled modestly. Richard continued. She has not only built an incredible career, she has carried this family through discipline and determination. Michael, you are fortunate to have such a remarkable wife. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. The moment felt strangely familiar. Another room, another audience, another version of the same story finding new listeners. Rachel reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand, smiling as though she expected me to play my usual part. Say something, she whispered softly. I looked around the patio. Friends, family, co-workers, people I genuinely cared about. None of them had created this misunderstanding. They had simply inherited it. I stood slowly and picked up my glass. The backyard became completely silent except for the distant hum of lawn sprinklers somewhere across the street. Richard, I began calmly. Thank you for your kind words. Rachel has worked very hard, and I have always been proud of everything she has accomplished. Several guests nodded approvingly. Rachel relaxed. She believed she already knew where the conversation was heading. I continued. There is only one thing I would like to add. My voice remained steady. No anger. No accusation. Every family deserves to be remembered accurately, especially after 12 years. Rachel's smile hesitated for the first time all afternoon. I could almost see the uncertainty appear behind her eyes. Melissa shifted slightly in her chair. Brian lowered his fork. Even the children stopped talking for a moment as the atmosphere quietly changed. I set my glass back onto the table without making a sound. I invited someone to stop by this afternoon, I said. Rachel frowned. You invited someone? I nodded once. Yes, someone who has known our household better than almost anyone for the past 15 years. Confusion spread across several faces. Richard looked toward the front of the house, as if expecting another neighbor to arrive. Rachel forced a small laugh. Who could possibly know our finances better than we do? Before I answered, the doorbell echoed through the house. The sound was ordinary, soft, almost forgettable. Yet every conversation stopped at once. I looked toward the front hallway and quietly said, that would be Daniel. Daniel Foster stepped through the front door carrying nothing more dramatic than a dark leather portfolio and a calm expression. He wore the same navy suit he had probably worn to 100 client meetings before this one. No one looking at him would have guessed he was about to become the most important person in the backyard. I walked inside to greet him while everyone remained seated beneath the patio. Thank you for coming, I said quietly. Daniel shook my hand with the same steady professionalism he had shown for the last 15 years. You said you needed a factual conversation, he replied. Facts are what I brought. We walked back together. Conversations faded into silence as every guest watched us cross the yard. Rachel forced a smile, but I noticed the tension around her eyes. Michael, she said, laughing softly, what is this? Are we turning a family barbecue into a business meeting? I remained calm. No. I am simply making sure everyone hears the complete story. Daniel nodded politely toward the guests before placing his portfolio on the patio table. Richard stood first, looking confused. Michael, is something wrong? I looked at him for a moment before answering. That depends on whether the truth is considered a problem. Nobody laughed. The afternoon air suddenly felt heavier. Even the children had wandered toward the far side of the yard, sensing that the adults were no longer talking about ordinary things. Rachel folded her arms. I do not understand why your accountant is here. Daniel answered before I could. Mrs. Bennett, I was invited because I maintain the financial records for Mr. Bennett's personal and business accounts. Rachel smiled politely. That is wonderful, but I do not see what that has to do with lunch. Daniel did not react. Normally, it would have nothing to do with lunch. He opened the portfolio and removed several neatly organized folders. However, Mr. Bennett informed me that a number of public statements have been made regarding the financial structure of this household. Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Brian slowly placed his drink on the table. Richard looked from Daniel to Rachel, waiting for someone to explain. Rachel laughed. Again, although it sounded noticeably weaker than before. Surely we are not discussing bank statements at a barbecue. I finally spoke. We are discussing accuracy. Daniel carefully placed the first summary sheet on the table where everyone closest could see it. This document summarizes 12 consecutive years of household operating expenses. His voice remained calm, almost clinical. Mortgage payments, property taxes, homeowners insurance, utilities, vehicle insurance, maintenance, renovations, vacation expenses, educational expenses, medical costs, household improvements. Richard leaned forward slightly. Rachel remained perfectly still. Daniel continued. Every category listed here was funded through accounts owned by Michael Bennett or through distributions generated by his business interests. Nobody interrupted him. The silence became almost physical. Rachel looked toward me and forced another smile. Well, of course. We are married. Everything belongs to both of us. Daniel nodded respectfully. Legally, many assets are shared. That is correct. He turned another page. The issue is not ownership. The issue is attribution. He placed several printed pages beside the financial summary. They were copies of social media posts, public photographs, and captions collected over several years. I recognized every one of them. Rachel smiling beside the pool. Rachel standing in front of our house. Rachel celebrating promotions. Rachel thanking herself for carrying the financial responsibility of the family. Daniel looked toward the guests instead of Rachel. These public statements consistently describe Mrs. Bennett as the sole or primary financial provider of the household. He paused briefly before placing another document beside the first. Our accounting records do not support those statements. Melissa quietly covered her mouth with one hand. Brian slowly leaned back in his chair without saying a word. Richard frowned as he studied the pages spread across the table. Rachel's mother looked confused rather than angry. Rachel finally spoke. This is ridiculous. People exaggerate online all the time. Daniel answered with remarkable patience. Perhaps they do. That is why accounting records exist. They do not exaggerate. He turned one final summary toward Richard. Every mortgage payment over the last 12 years originated from Mr. Bennett's accounts. Every major renovation. Every property tax payment. Every insurance premium. Every utility bill. Every anniversary vacation. Every documented household expense. Richard looked down at the paperwork for what felt like an entire minute. Then he slowly raised his eyes toward his daughter. His voice was quiet, almost careful. Rachel, is this accurate? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I had known her, confidence failed to arrive. I stood beside the table without satisfaction, without anger, and without raising my voice. Truth had finally entered the conversation, and unlike every joke that came before it, nobody seemed willing to laugh. Richard did not ask the question again. He did not need to. The silence sitting over the patio answered it long before anyone found the courage to speak. Rachel stared at the documents spread across the table as though the numbers might somehow rearrange themselves if she waited long enough. They did not. Paper has no sympathy. It only remembers. Her mother slowly lowered her glass and looked from one page to another. Rachel, she said gently, your father asked you something. Rachel swallowed. It is not that simple. Daniel remained standing beside the table with his hands folded in front of him. He never interrupted. He never argued. His work had already spoken. Richard picked up one of the summary sheets and adjusted his reading glasses. This says Michael paid every mortgage payment. Daniel nodded once. That is correct. Richard turned another page. The pool renovation. Funded entirely through Mr. Bennett's investment distribution. Another page. Property taxes. Mr. Bennett. Another. Homeowners insurance. Mr. Bennett. Richard looked up slowly. The vacations? Daniel answered without hesitation. Every documented family vacation over the last 12 years was purchased through accounts under Mr. Bennett's financial management. Nobody moved. Even the breeze seemed to disappear. From the backyard, Melissa quietly looked toward Rachel with an expression that no longer held admiration. It held confusion. Rachel, she whispered, I honestly believed everything you told us. Rachel rubbed her forehead before forcing a nervous laugh. Everyone is making this much bigger than it really is. Her voice lacked the confidence it had carried only an hour earlier. Michael and I share everything. Sometimes I simplified things when people asked questions. I finally looked directly at her. Simplified. My voice remained calm. She nodded quickly. People always ask who pays for this or who bought that. I just answered. I held her gaze for several seconds. You never answered. You replaced the truth. No one spoke after that. The words settled over the table with quiet certainty. Daniel reached into his portfolio one final time. There is one additional document Mr. Bennett asked me to bring. He carefully placed a thin folder beside the others. This contains authorized user records for the household credit accounts. Rachel's eyes widened almost immediately. Daniel opened the file with the same careful precision he had shown all afternoon. These statements show that Mrs. Bennett maintained an authorized user card linked to Mr. Bennett's primary account for discretionary household purchases. Richard looked down again. Luxury department stores, designer boutiques, furniture galleries, spa memberships, airline tickets, restaurant reservations, jewelry purchases. Everything appeared with transaction dates, merchant names, and funding sources. Rachel quickly folded her arms. Michael told me to use those cards. I did, I answered quietly. Because I trusted you. She looked toward me hopefully, as though that sentence somehow repaired everything. It did not. I continued speaking before she could interrupt. I never cared what you spent. I cared about why you kept telling everyone you were paying for everything while quietly using accounts you knew were mine. Rachel's shoulders dropped. For the first time since our guests arrived, she had no prepared answer. Her father slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the table. He looked older than he had that morning. Rachel, he said softly, all these years I congratulated you because I believed you were carrying this family. His voice almost broke on the final words. I never once thanked Michael because I believed he was depending on you. Rachel lowered her eyes. Her mother reached across the table but stopped halfway, unsure whether comfort still belonged in the conversation. Brian finally spoke after remaining silent for nearly 20 minutes. Michael, he said carefully, why did you wait so long to say anything? I looked around the patio. Every face waited for the same answer. I took a slow breath before speaking. Because I thought protecting my marriage mattered more than protecting my reputation. The backyard became silent again. Every joke felt temporary. Every false story felt harmless. I kept believing Rachel would eventually correct people herself. I glanced toward her before finishing the thought. Instead, the story became larger every year until even the people closest to us believed it more than the truth. Richard slowly nodded. Nobody argued with that. They could not. The documents remained spread across the table between us like 12 years of quiet witnesses finally given permission to speak. Rachel stared at them without lifting her head. The performance that had taken years to build had not collapsed because someone shouted louder. It collapsed because simple arithmetic refused to participate in the fiction any longer. No one reached for the food anymore. The brisket cooled beneath its foil. Ice melted into untouched glasses. The backyard that had been filled with laughter only minutes earlier now held nothing but quiet reflection. Daniel slowly closed the last folder and stepped back from the table. His responsibility had ended the moment the documents spoke for themselves. He looked at me once. I nodded with quiet gratitude. There was nothing left for him to prove. Richard remained seated, his hands folded together as though he were trying to understand how 12 years of assumptions had unraveled in a single afternoon. Finally, he looked at me. Michael, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I shook my head. You believed what you were repeatedly told. Anyone would have. He lowered his eyes. That does not make it right. Rachel's mother turned toward her daughter. There was disappointment in her face, but even more than disappointment, there was sadness. Why? She asked softly. You already had a successful career. Why was that not enough? Rachel stared at the tabletop for several seconds before answering. At first it was only a joke. Her voice barely carried across the patio. People laughed. They congratulated me. They admired me. After a while, correcting them became harder than letting them believe it. Nobody interrupted her. She continued speaking slowly, almost as if she were hearing the truth herself for the first time. Then every promotion made the story sound more believable. I convinced myself it was harmless because Michael never argued. I nodded once. I never argued because I trusted you. The words landed with more weight than I expected. Rachel finally looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but there were no dramatic outbursts. Just exhaustion. I thought you did not care what people believed. I did not, I answered honestly. Until the people closest to us began believing a version of me that no longer existed. Melissa quietly wiped at her eyes. Michael, she said, I joked about you living off Rachel because I honestly believed that was true. I am sorry. Brian nodded immediately. So am I. One by one, the others around the table offered similar apologies. None of them sounded forced. They sounded like people realizing they had judged someone using borrowed facts instead of real ones. I thanked each of them because none of them had created the lie. They had simply inherited it. Daniel gathered the folders and slid them back into his portfolio. Before leaving, he looked toward the group. Financial records are useful for many reasons, he said calmly. Most people think they exist to satisfy banks or tax authorities. In reality, they also preserve memory. They remember what people eventually forget. With that, he shook my hand and quietly walked toward the front door. Nobody stopped him. Nobody needed to. His work was complete. Richard slowly stood and walked over to me. For several moments he said nothing. Then he placed a hand on my shoulder. For years I believed you were being carried. His voice was steady but filled with regret. Today I discovered you were carrying far more than bills. I smiled faintly. Marriage is supposed to feel that way. He nodded. Only when both people carry the truth together. Rachel remained seated while everyone else slowly began cleaning the table. She looked around the backyard as though seeing it differently for the first time. The patio, the pool, the outdoor kitchen, the flower beds she proudly showed visitors every spring. None of those things had changed. Only the story attached to them had. She finally stood and walked toward me after the others had drifted a respectful distance away. I do not know how to fix this, she whispered. I looked at the house we had built together, then back at her. The financial records were never the real problem. She frowned. Then what was? I answered quietly. The bills were always paid. Trust was not. The breeze returned, moving gently through the trees surrounding the yard. Somewhere down the street, children laughed while riding their bicycles, completely unaware that an ordinary Saturday had quietly changed two lives forever. I looked around the patio one last time before gathering the empty glasses from the table. The truth had not shouted. It had not humiliated anyone. It had simply arrived with patience, documentation, and silence. Sometimes that is the strongest voice a person will ever need.